Thanks so much. As Daniel said, this is intended to be interactive. And actually, if you have, at one of the other venues where we've presented this, heard our energy scenarios work before, stay tuned anyway, because we have continued to iterate on what this needs to look like so that people can engage with this work. And we were particularly excited for this audience because there's a lot of people in the room who I think can engage in what I'm going to call a much more creative thought exercise than just kind of your average bear. And so when you're at a university, you're almost challenged to think in these more creative, big, expansive spaces. And so I'm hoping that you are willing to kind of go there with us today. Let me just briefly tell you a little bit about kind of what we're going to do. I'm going to give you a brief intro on what Team Pennsylvania is, Team PA. I don't assume that everybody knows. Second, I'll just tell you what scenarios are, why we decided to do this, why at this moment. And then our colleague Adam Walters, who is the Senior Energy Advisor for the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development, is going to give this level set around Pennsylvania's energy landscape, which is an important place for us to start. And then Rachel Phillips, my colleague at Team PA and our SVP of Impact and Innovation, is going to lead us through the different scenarios that we came up with. And also then we kind of put some data to that, and so she's going to walk us through that. And then we'll open it up to any questions that you might have. But throughout, we're going to be asking you to engage with the presentation. On some of the tables, there's a little QR code. We'll put it on the screen too, but you can share with your friends when we get there. So the About Team PA, we have been around since when Governor Ridge was in office. Back in 1997, the organization was founded with this idea that government and business really need a neutral place to work together, and that business can be better if they're working with government, and government can be better if they're working with business. And you needed a neutral convener, a public-private partnership to do that. And so that became Team Pennsylvania Foundation, Team PA. And so we have, since that founding, been co-chaired by whoever the sitting governor is, R or D after their name, and a private sector leader, a CEO of a Pennsylvania-based company. On the public sector side of our board, as a public-private partnership, we have representation from the legislature and from agency secretaries in addition to the governor. And then on the private sector side of our board, there's representation from business and industry, from academia, from nonprofit organizations, from organized labor. And we really try to have on our board a microcosm of Pennsylvania's economy, representing all different geographies, demographics, size of companies and businesses. For a while, the president of CMU was on our board of directors, and it's a really nice place to talk about what happens in Pennsylvania's economy, regardless of your political affiliation or your industry or background. Our mission as an organization is focusing on all of Pennsylvania, all Pennsylvanians, in terms of our economic health and what we can accelerate when we're working together. And we specifically focus in 4 ways. Not everything is a good fit for us, but in areas that require collaboration, that's a good fit for us. I think energy transition is actually a perfect example of where you really need government, business, all these other partners figuring out how to work together in a nonpartisan way. And secondly, we look at areas where Pennsylvania can lead. And this includes leading nationally, internationally, regionally, but we look at areas where Pennsylvania can be and should be a leader. We also look where there's opportunity for significant impact. Where can we actually see measurable, sustainable impact on our economic future? And finally, we think about the actual participation in Pennsylvania's economy, and there is a strong business case to be made for more people participating more fully in Pennsylvania's economy. And so when we filter what work we do and how we work, we think in those 4 areas and make sure that it's aligned with those 4 goals. The areas in which we work are the drivers of Pennsylvania's economy, and I wish that all the work kind of fit neatly in these little circles. They don't. They really operate like gears and levers, and they all kind of impact one another. And there's quite a lot of overlap in these areas, as I imagine all of you in the room can think of and think through. And in those areas, we bring people together. We think that just like we are a public-private partnership as a board of directors, that we need spaces where we can actually bring together partners of all kinds who share this goal of accelerating Pennsylvania's economy, And so this means that we convene these cross-sector collaboratives. Some of you in the room participate in our energy collaborative or even our manufacturing collaborative or our agriculture collaborative. And we serve as that neutral broker and try to identify what are the priorities that can accelerate economic growth. And participation really is very open and dynamic. It's not like an advisory board where you have a set number of participants. And this is how we try to keep a pulse on what's going on within our local communities across Pennsylvania's economy. And we are a good connect the dots organization, in part because we are flying at kind of a state level altitude, thinking about what's going on in the different pockets of the economy and where we have all these assets and resources and people who need to connect with one another to realize opportunities together. So how did we end up doing scenarios? We had actually engaged in a scenarios process before. As an organization in a pre-pandemic world, we did scenario planning, and Adam Walters was a really important part of those workshops. And we realized that a lot had changed. We were actually just talking yesterday about the fact that energy was not necessarily the hot topic for everyone, even though people in the energy world were saying, this is the hot topic that everybody needs to care about. Well, now, several years later, I think that the conversation really has shifted, and energy feels like it's at the intersection of a number of different topics, everything from how we think about AI and data centers, the theme of this week, connecting to AI, but also how we power our regional economies. Energy becomes a critical part of everything from our national security and supply chain to thinking about how we grow our local economy. We decided, though, that we wanted to engage in a way where we were bringing lots of partners together. And we, as an energy collaborative, wanted to figure out what are the topics and issues that we should surface as an organization that Team PA is uniquely qualified to move forward. So we brought together a lot of different folks who participate in our energy collaborative with some world-renowned scenario planning facilitators to walk us through a whole process. So I'm going to tell you kind of what that is. So for those of you who are not familiar with scenarios, we're talking about putting together not predictions. We're not doing forecasts. We're exploring different possible alternative future realities. And we want to ask this question, not just what happens with energy, for example, but what's happening in the world around us. And everything then has implications for energy and for other systems within our economy. What happens in terms of our society? What happens in terms of our communities? What happens in terms of major events? And then we want to figure out what are some different possible future realities, plausible, relevant, yet challenging, not the most likely necessarily. What are the different possible future realities that we could consider? And we looked at this from a period of 2025 to 2050, so over the course of a generation. To further zero in on what scenarios are and what scenarios are not, with this diagram that I swear is not some sort of mammogram, but it's actually, it's a picture of looking at all the different possible futures that we could have had, the different paths. And the little red path that you see, I wonder if you can see my mouse here. Yeah, so this little red path that you see, that just happened to be the path that we took in the past to get to where we are now. And then there are all of these different possible futures. What we did is try to figure out three. What are three possible scenarios from where we are now for where we could go into the future? And again, these are imaginary, but hopefully plausible, possible future realities. And we use this scenario planning process as a tool to help us understand how we actually make different choices. And you can take this as an individual, you can take this as part of an organization or a team within your organization, you could take this within your industry. And part of it is then it's a tool for how you make decisions and think about things, and it's a long-term kind of visioning exercise that hopefully allows you to grapple with, well, in this possible future, I might do this, but in this possible future, I would not want to do these things. But I want to say what they are not. They are not necessarily what's most likely to happen. And actually, we did come up with some ideas where it almost felt just like too boring. Like, what are the chances that nothing interesting happens over the next 25 years? Pretty slim, right? So we eliminated the ones that felt too boring, and we tried to actually make them a little bit provocative, a little bit interesting, not wildly so. And again, we're not trying to predict what will happen, but I also want to say we're not trying to say what we want to have happen. So this is not an orientation toward a particular path for the future. It also doesn't substitute decision making. It can just kind of help you think about how you might want to make decisions, nor is it any sort of immediate solution, but it can help bring you to how you might think about solutions. And so to further bring it home, because I found that presenting this work requires a lot of contextualizing so that you can understand where we're coming from. I want you to imagine in a pandemic, we're in a post-pandemic society, but imagine if we had gamed it out ahead of time. Both as an individual within your own household, in your own community, in the organization in which you work. I was thinking about how, a lot of our state government workers, who I work really closely with, many of them did not have laptops, they had desktops. And if they did have a laptop, sometimes they didn't have a camera. And so when we found that we were suddenly able to work remotely and do things by video, many of them were ill-equipped to do their jobs from home and to pivot quickly. You can imagine that if state government had kind of gamed out, well, what if we have a pandemic where we want people to work from home? It may have changed small budgetary decisions with when we actually invest in new computers, or when we do, that we switch them to laptops and we make sure that they have a video. It's a hypothetical. I know that I personally would have purchased some travel insurance for a particular trip that I was unable to get refunded without, maybe I could have gone through a bunch of hoops. I know that I would have better stocked up on hand sanitizer or thought about having masks. And I think that all of us think about our toilet paper stockpile a little bit differently. Okay, we're gonna try out our Mentimeter function here. So what I'd like you to do, and you're gonna see this slide, those of you who've used Mentimeter before, you would see the poll question. You also have, some of you on some of your tables, sorry we didn't have enough copies, have the QR code here. So here's the question for you. So much like COVID-19, I want you to think about what is a possible black swan event, something that could just show up and then could actually impact, but doesn't have to be directly related to, but could impact our energy development, our energy utilization over the next 25 years. So type it in, and we're gonna see, in theory, we're gonna see the responses come up on the screen. And I can put the QR code back if you need it, or you can find the little paper on your table. But here, I'll do that just in case. Oh no, then you can't do the question. Sorry, now you could do the question. Sorry, I forgot about this, okay. Oh yeah, now we're coming up with stuff. Oh wow, there's a lot of interesting things coming up on this. And you should be able to see it on your screen as well. But we're talking, aliens and cyber tech, what? It's a good audience for this. Yeah, you guys can get very creative on this. This is good. Everything from cold fusion and geopolitical turmoil and tax credit elimination and World War III. It's going to be a wild 25 years with this audience. So stay in that mindset. Stay in that slightly creative, slightly thought-provoking mindset. Because, and I can't, oh, okay, we're still adding them. All right, so I'm gonna shift us over. Remember this creative state. And now I wanna make sure we're all starting off on the same page about what Pennsylvania's current energy landscape looks like. And so, without further ado, Adam Walters.
What they're clapping for.
Between the two of us.
You're clapping for Abby, right? I didn't even start yet. No, thank you, Abby, for the introduction. Just as a quick reminder, my name is Adam Walters. I'm the Senior Energy Advisor at the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. So as Abby described, the role of Team Pennsylvania in sort of advancing economic opportunities in Pennsylvania, we work very closely and in close coordination with her and her team. And energy being such a focus point for the foundation, it's really exciting to be able to get to work closely with them and then participate in things like this today. So I'm going to do a little bit of level setting. Hit the space bar, right? The arrow? Yeah. There we go. I love this slide. We used this slide when we did this iteration in 2018, and it's a little bit duplicative, if I'm being honest, of what Abby just laid out, but I think it adds in helping to get us in the proper mindset for engaging and ultimately undertaking a scenarios process, which is done, all over the world, large corporations, for countries, for regions, for the globe. We're trying to do it and bring it to Pennsylvania and do it for an individual state, which I think is really unique. So take a look at this picture. It's New York City, circa, I think it was taken in 1911, or at least that's what I tell everybody, so I hope it's correct. But what you see in this picture is, for the day, all of the dominant modes of transportation, right? You have literally just people walking around, horses, horse-drawn carriage. You have the electric trolley car, which would have been a relatively new and exciting development in the landscape of cities across America, or at least the larger ones. But what doesn't always catch people's eye right away, which probably has by now, is the image in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. A little postage stamp-sized picture of the wheel, the tire, the wheel, and the wheel well of what is probably a Model T. It's an automobile. Now, hindsight is 20/20, as they say, and we can look back from where we are right now all the way back to 1911, the turn of the century, and have a really good understanding of how everything transformed within the transportation sector since then, right? We have the triumph, if you will, of Ford's Model T. We have the build out of the federal interstate highway system. We have a huge network, now global network, of refueling stations with gasoline for vehicles, and all of which leads us to where we are today, which is sort of the ubiquity of the automobile. And that's to say nothing about helicopters and airplanes, which fundamentally transformed how we get from place to place globally. But if you took this picture in 1911, or you were standing on that street viewing this, you should be forgiven for not being able to predict how all of those pathways unfolded from that day forward. So go back to the picture of the various pathways. There's the one we took, there's this moment in time, and there's all the different things that could unfold in the future. And I think this image just does a really good job of capturing that. And just to reflect a little bit further, I mean, in 1911, cars were a plaything for rich people. We didn't have the gasoline refueling stations. The first one, 1913, just down the street in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's a very cool Pennsylvania historical marker on the corner of Euclid and Baum Boulevard. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. And so it's just, it's important then, I think, to take this into consideration, acknowledge that we have great uncertainty in front of us, not just within energy, but within all forms of life, economic, political, social, et cetera. Energy is a big one that drives some of those decisions and is also affected and driven by, conversely, a lot of what we do in society. So that's why we do this. That's why it's important to undertake scenario planning, and that's why we're excited to share it today. All right, so we bring these slides to a lot of different audiences. This is a group that probably does not need me to lecture really at all about Pennsylvania's energy history, Pennsylvania's current status in energy, so I'll be really quick here. We've always been an energy powerhouse in Pennsylvania. We have been at the forefront, and not just participating in, but leading and helping to drive every major energy transition since our inception. And so just, quickly from left to right, this is not an all-inclusive list of those transitions. First commercial oil well in 1859, just up the road in Titusville. Beginning in the 1970s, we were the location, and still are, of a number of different large-scale, grid-scale nuclear power generating facilities. And this is the point in time, maybe in the middle to the end of the 1970s, where we began to generate more power within the state than we're using and become now an uninterrupted power exporter, or an exporter of electrons both within and throughout PJM, the New York ISO, and all up and down the East Coast. So we're more or less the battery of the Eastern Seaboard in many ways. Begins in the 70s. And then, of course, what we're seeing right now, which is another example of what was would have been difficult to predict shortly before it happened, which is the advent of unconventional means of extracting shale oil and shale gas. In the Pennsylvania context, that's almost exclusively natural gas. But again, it's a moment in time where you can go back, and some folks in the room may have read some of the literature in the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. A lot of things that we were concerned about, and climate was certainly one of them, but within that context was energy scarcity. Well, we have the shale gas boom, and that sort of turns itself on its head, and that's something that would have been difficult to predict again until around the time it was happening. And so our current status, obviously, we're an energy powerhouse. I'm actually not going to go through all of these line by line. I'll just let everybody, reflect on them for a second and really just comment on the last two there. Pennsylvania's, role in the coal economy is still a relatively big one, and it's big from an international perspective. We're the second largest exporter of coal to international markets, and I don't mean to reflect on this as like a good thing or a bad thing or even an indifferent thing. But as we see coal leaving the power generation fleet as the historically preferred very mobile and flexible fuel in favor of lower cost natural gas, this is still a big part of what Pennsylvania does and the role that it plays in the global energy system. And I think it's just important to be able to locate ourselves accurately in that system. And of course, we're the second largest supplier of energy to other states. This is the combination of the electrons that flow to other states that I mentioned earlier, as well as molecular exports of natural gas. We use about 20–25% of the gas that we bring out of the ground in state actually here. The rest of it goes to markets globally as well as nationally. And so we have a really strong energy history. We have a formidable energy picture. We rival and exceed nations, not just other states in terms of our energy system and our energy profile, but it's always a changing one. Energy systems are fundamentally changing every single day. A lot of what's driving this is well known and going to be particularly well known to the folks in this room, right? We need to address climate change. We have a changing climate. We need to be able to mitigate for it and be able to course correct in ways that protect us, protect generations moving forward. At the same time, we have increasing demands being placed on the energy system. We're going to hear a lot more about that tomorrow, particularly with AI and what that means from a supply and demand dynamic standpoint, particularly within the power markets. And so I think one of the best ways to communicate or the most succinct ways to describe the energy transition that we're facing right now is how can we continue to produce and use energy and do so in a way that impacts the environment less, right? In the past, it was new technologies that made things faster and efficient and cheaper, but now we have a different sort of prerogative or a different reason for engaging in this, but nonetheless just as important. And when we look at Pennsylvania's history and we look at Pennsylvania's place in the energy landscape, I think it's clear that, the decisions that we make, or we have opportunities at least to make the decisions, that Pennsylvania remains on the forefront and ends up being a leader in this round of energy transition. And then Abby mentioned it earlier, and I'll just kind of conclude with this slide, which is to say that, we're not just looking, scenarios are not just energy stories. They're stories about how different facets of society and the economy, political environment can unfold, how that affects and is also affected by energy systems. So we need to take into consideration some of the other cultural and political forces that are at play. And there's also things that are completely out of our control, right? Decisions that the national government makes in Washington, D.C., and how we engage with our allies, our enemies, how we engage in global governance institutions. These are all things that maybe not overnight, but eventually impact every individual state. And sort of how does Pennsylvania not just view that, but respond to that, and what challenges do those present, and then what opportunities come from that as well. So it's a big picture set of stories that we're trying to convey here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Yeah. Okay, so, and by the way, you can read these in detail on our website, but you're going to hear three stories. One we call highways, one that we call homesteads, and one that we call fields. And remember, these are imaginary possible futures. This is not us predicting or giving some sort of preference to certain future realities. Went through a whole workshop with lots of different participants, and we came up with these three possible futures. But I want to note that there were drivers and uncertainties that we kind of took into account here. And so these drivers that are common across all these scenarios take into account what Adam just shared. Like Pennsylvania as an energy leader, it takes into account the demographic trend generally of where Pennsylvania is going. It takes into account this need for economic growth, for development of all kinds of sorts, including, AI. It includes where we stand right now in terms of natural gas and this need for energy transition. So it takes all that into account across all the scenarios. And then there are certain uncertainties that play out a little bit differently. Adam alluded to this at the end, this idea that you've got, different things with politics. You've got a whole different, you can imagine different possible futures with the speed at which energy transition takes place, what we prioritize, everything from carbon emissions to thinking about technology development, and then what happens in terms of population, right? So in other words, there are certain uncertainties that we can consider for each, but then where they go looks a little different for different scenarios. So to present our scenarios and then the data that goes along with it, and have your phones ready because there will be some Mentimeter questions at the end of these, so pay attention to the 3 different stories. I'll turn it over to Rachel.
All right. Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks, Abby. So keep in mind, these are stories. And as Abby mentioned, there is a lot more detail behind these stories than we have time to cover today. So I'm giving you the 40,000-foot view of each of these stories. So hopefully it's enough for you to get a sense of what the essence of each story, so that you get a sense of where we were headed with these 3 different types. So the first is highways. So highways, when you think about them, there's a lot of twists and turns. There's on-ramps, there's off-ramps. There's different directions that these highways can take you. So this is where we think of our energy transition. That's the primary focus of this story. So there's various energy sources as well, and emissions will change quite a bit depending upon what those sources are at a given point in this scenario. There are numerous economic impacts and implications as a result, and it is a top-down, Pennsylvania-centric approach. There are other drivers at the national level, but primarily this is a Pennsylvania-centric story. So from 2025 to 2030, this is the time period where we're speeding up on the highway. So this is the time when gas is king. So natural gas is prevalent here in Pennsylvania, a big part of what we do. And we also know that high-tech industries are driving demand. So the energy to power this demand is coming from something that we have an abundance of, this natural gas. So the state at this time must consider the trade-offs of infrastructure investment between more fossil fuels and renewable energies. But the state is taking an all-of-the-above approach, so everything is still in the mix. As we move forward, this is the time when we're slowing down and falling behind. So we've got an economic boom that's slowing, and as a result, energy demand is stalling. That means that emissions are also going down. There's political resistance that's increasing for renewables, and the states surrounding Pennsylvania are transitioning to other sources rather than fossil fuels, which is leaving Pennsylvania reliant on natural gas. The climate change impacts are exacerbated by indecisive policies despite the growth of environmental awareness. As we move forward a little bit, we have the sense of taking an off-ramp in another direction. So this idea that decarbonization is a priority, but faces some headwinds. So there's increasing energy costs, there's an issue with speed, there's an issue with grid reliability. So this is all challenging us to think of a new direction. There have been mixed results from this top-down approach. So the reforms like electrification mandates and energy targets, and there have been some successes and some failures, which have led to community resistance and inequality. As we close out the final decade of this story of highways, this is where the crisis and the course correction comes into play. So you've got the rural and the ex-urban communities who are resisting renewables and EV mandates. There are permitting issues, there are legal issues, And there's a lot of top-down criticism to push for more long-term flexible planning. We've got more market and industry and community voices entering the conversation. So ultimately, as you can see, the whole conversation here is around energy transition. Before we go ahead and summarize, I'm just going to invite my colleagues to add anything you'd like to the highway scenario. You good? Okay. Perfect. So again, this is just a quick summary. This is all about energy transition driven at the state level with polarized constituencies. And you see over time how emissions ebb and flow with respect to what's going on in the environment at the time. So get those phones ready, folks. It's time for our Mentimeter. We'll have a little bit of a rapid fire on this. Okay. So the first question is, how plausible is highways from 1 to 5, with 1 being least likely and 5 being highly plausible? There are multiple questions for each scenario, so we'll go through this relatively quickly. Yeah, that's what we're seeing. So it's trending towards the more plausible side. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Given your role in industry, how much do you like or dislike highways as a scenario? So the lower end is you strongly dislike, and on the higher end, you highly favor this scenario. And I recognize at this point, this is the one and only scenario that you've been able to see so far, so makes sense that you don't have anything else to compare it to unless you've read our scenarios in advance. Okay. Looks like some centric views there with a slight trend downwards to slightly dislike. All right. What policies and or infrastructure would be needed in highways for it to come to fruition? What are your thoughts here? Fuel diversity. Education and energy jobs, carbon taxes. New nuclear. All of the above approach. Okay. I like that. We're seeing carbon tax and no carbon tax. And that's the thing to keep in mind as we go through these energy scenarios. They are conversation starters. So where you see yourself and your organization within this conversation, it's important to see those intersections with other organizations and how you'll be interacting with those to make this type of thing come to fruition. If it's a scenario, for example, that you strongly dislike, what would you have to do to make sure that doesn't happen? All right, moving forward, what if highways became a reality? What would it mean for your business or your industry? Disruption, opportunity, two sides of the same coin. Adjustments, okay. Net positive for your industry or your business. More opportunity, more uncertainty. Creativity, inefficient. Moderate improvements and opportunities in industry and significant positives. Frustration from the lack of progression, accessibility for those that live further, but disruptive approach. Centralization, need to diversify energy suppliers, retraining. I think these are a lot of themes that will come up time and time again. So it's great to to see them surfacing here. Abby, did you want to make a comment? No? Okay, perfect. More grassroots organizing, okay. All right, so moving forward, as we leave the energy transition scenarios, that was highways, we move into our second story, which is all about homesteads. So this is the story of getting back to William Penn's vision of a pluralism that's not driven specifically by one ethnic group or religious group. It's a character beyond where many flourish. So communities have a role in defining their energy vision. So keep that lens in mind as we go through this story. So the homestead movement is not unlike the return to land movement from about 50 years ago, if folks are familiar with that. You've got an aging population which is retiring, baby boomers and whatnot, and these folks are going to require some multi-generational housing. And this is reinforced by media, by books, different sporting events that are attracting folks home, like the World Cup. And there's a sense of crisis that requires a reboot of state government and and requires us to have locales take greater control of their energy future. So over the course of the next decade, there's a growing regionalism as a result. As communities lean into this approach, some lean into different energy resources. So for example, in the Southeast, in the area of Philly, for example, it might be more renewables. Others might be leaning into coal or natural gas with carbon capture just as a result of what they have access to within their communities. They're leaning into these different energy resources that make sense for their communities. There's a lot of public-private partnership. There's a lot of decentralized decision-making. And the lead actors are turning away from Harrisburg to their local community leaders in order to make this energy scenario come to life. So for the final 5 years of this is where we say sure-footedness takes root. And this is where we have a slower, steadier approach to decarbonization and innovation. We've got more community buy-in because it's being driven by the community level, which is leading to a more balanced approach for adoption compared to the top-down approach that we saw in the previous scenario. We've got a self-direction of our energy future in this case. So ultimately, we've got this idea of focus on local well-being and regional partnerships that are driving this transition. And we've got local civic leaders who are playing that prominent role for us. And there's lots of variation by region to make sure that we've created room and space for the individual voices and communities for the types of energy that make sense for them. Abby, Adam, anything to add on this one? Okay. All right, time for the phones again. Same questions, you know the drill. We'll move forward to see the first one. How plausible is Homesteads on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being least likely, 5 being highly plausible. Now you've at least got one other scenario to compare it to. All right, looks like it's a little less plausible at this point than we saw with highways. Given your role in industry, how much do you like or dislike homesteads as a scenario? All right, trending upwards. Folks seem to like this one a lot more for themselves and their organizations than highways. All right. Okay, this one takes a little more work. What policies and/or infrastructure would be needed in homesteads? Lobbying reduction, deregulation, grid transformation, that's a great one. Community energy, community equity, renewable build-out, financing support, deregulation is prominent there, and decentralization. All right. So deregulation and decentralization seem core to the Homesteads movement. What if Homesteads became a reality? What would it mean for your business or your industry? Greater options? It would mean nothing. Okay. Frustration, patchwork shuttle diplomacy, innovation opportunities, less policy certainty. Possible boom could be hugely positive, though the risk would be that local leadership cuts off its nose to spite its face. Really good consideration. Service diversification, localized fleets, it would need much more local financing opportunities and not from the state and federal government, correct? So more public-private partnership. Consumerism is depressed as we simply meet demand rather than create it. Ambiguity, more NIMBY attitudes, that's a great highlight there. Uneven performance and possible inequity, okay. All right, thank you for the good participation there. We've come to our last story. So fields. This is the one where economic growth is the predominant policy driver. So the idea is that during this story, we grow extremely fast for the first half, we build on our successes, and we reach an inflection point where we address issues that surfaced through that growth. We need to address those climate issues at some point a little bit later on in the scenario more aggressively because we ignored them during the first half to some degree. So in the first 5 years, we are choosing growth. This is what we're prioritizing. We've got energy demand growing as a result of artificial intelligence, and we're using natural gas with additional in-basin use as the primary source. So this is also something that ends up with a more predictable regulatory environment that attracts businesses. The federal government is pulling back slightly and doesn't want to engage in global institutions like it has historically, and it opens up an opportunity for the state to take a stronger role insofar as regulation is concerned. It's focusing on energy-enabled economic growth. That's what we're seeing in the first 5 years. So over the course of the next decade, as we've labeled it a winner in many fields, Pennsylvania is emerging as a competitive place for business, and it will remain in an all-of-the-above strategy for energy. In a regional context, they are in the surrounding states where they are limiting options. So we're keeping, again, everything on the table in Pennsylvania to allow for that diversification. So we've got a sense of folks returning to Pennsylvania due to the jobs available, due to the economic opportunities, and the Pennsylvania government has become a little bit more nimble in creating a business-friendly ecosystem to support. Businesses' successes begin building by the end of the decade, and it's largely driven by this Pennsylvania energy scenario. So as we get to the next 5 years, this is where we realize that there are limits to economic growth, and success is unevenly distributed. So you've got big hubs like Pittsburgh and Philly that are benefiting from a lot of this energy transition, with other pockets throughout the state. But you've got rural communities feeling left behind and resisting municipal consolidation. There are fewer white-collar jobs and a lot of climate implications as a result. So in the latter part of this decade, we see businesses and governments recognizing the need for more sustainable energy transition. Pennsylvania can do this quickly by capitalizing on the previous planning that they did so diligently and by keeping all energy options available. There's a broad-based approach to business, and there's an increasing role of the effective state government institutions. So we need to catch up to other parts of the US and other parts of the globe who have been prioritizing the energy transition, but we can do so more nimbly as a result of the business entities that we've set out here in Pennsylvania. We've got a competitive economic infrastructure that allows us to do that more quickly from how we've established. So we can adopt more renewable clean energy technology a little bit more quickly, and we've got that foundation of flexibility, optionality, and economic success to serve as a catalyst for advanced nuclear infrastructure, for carbon capture and storage, and different geothermal aspects as well. So, you know the drill by now. Here we are concluding fields. So this is, again, the focus on the economy, with the state government being the primary driver. We've got a lot of growth that's attracting folks home, and we have sacrificed in the short term the carbon emissions, and we have to tackle them a little bit later in the scenario. So go ahead and whip out those phones. It's time for the Mentimeter. How plausible is fields from 1 to 5? All right, so we're seeing around the same, a little bit lower in plausibility than highways. Given your role in industry, how much do you like or dislike fields as a scenario? All right. Folks seem to like it quite a bit, comparatively speaking. Okay. What policies or infrastructure would need to be in fields? Batteries, oligopoly, job support for new grads, tax incentives, data centers, strong rural development, trying to make sure nobody's left behind, deregulation. Okay, deregulation and tax incentives seem to be the most prominent. Efficient permitting, that's a good one to highlight. Very good. Okay. Appreciate everybody's participation there. What if fields becomes a reality? What would it mean for your business or your industry? Excuse me. Growth. Greater opportunities. Lots of growth, lots of opportunities, expansion, good funding for research. Improvement in operational efficiency, that's always good to see. Improved regional customer base, more unmet needs to solve. Yes, with progress, more problems evolve and surface as well. Bigger roles in public-private partnerships. Rural-urban divides. Okay, very good. So as we close here, this is just a quick comparison of all three of the stories that we shared today of highways, homesteads, and fields. So, with highways being primarily focused on energy transition, homesteads on local well-being, and fields on the economy, there are a number of different folks who lead in each of these scenarios, and the social and political environment changes slightly depending upon what story we're telling. So too does the annual carbon emissions as a result. So what we're going to do now is we're going to show you a little bit of the data modeling that Seth Bloomsack was able to do for us at Penn State to bring these scenarios to life. But before we do that, we are going to ask you a couple more questions on Mentimeter. So the first is, do you favor regional alliances and local policies, or the same policies for all regions? Top down, top down. Regional alliances and local policies, or top-down policies? What do you prefer? Oh, wow. Okay. So about 2/3 for the regional alliances and local policies. And from where you sit in your organization, rank each story from best to worst case scenario. What does that look like for you? All right, looks like fields and homesteads are neck and neck, with fields barely coming out on top and highways trailing both. All right, here's the fun stuff. I promise not to go into too much detail or belabor this, so appreciate everybody staying with us up until this point. Just a couple more things to share with you before we close. So here we've got a quick look at the Pennsylvania generation output by scenario. So in highways, you see that natural gas is king. Nuclear, we've got a little bit more on the back end, so that's not in the upfront, but it's at the back end of the scenario. You also see in there some utility scale solar, and you have this cumulative effect over the 25-year period for what that energy mix looks like. In homesteads, you've got a pretty steady generation. You look at the mix and diversity there, it looks pretty steady over the course of that time period. As we look at fields, this is where you have to keep in mind that you're generating more power. There's definitely an energy mix there, but the pie is much larger from when we started in 2025. So just keep that in mind as we think about the power generation output. Given these scenarios, the way that the data is modeled from 2030 to 2050, we see a significant reduction in emissions for the highway scenario, slightly less for homesteads and even less for fields. But that's largely due to this idea that in fields in particular, we're sacrificing some of that upfront emissions reduction to propel economic growth. So it's something that we have to think of for decades beyond to make up some of that emissions reductions efforts later. Here on this page, you see the cumulative power generation CapEx investment. So in highways, you've got this idea of more advanced nuclear, the utility scale solar. In homesteads, you're kind of extending what's already there and what's already been invested in the state of Pennsylvania, so just doing more of the same to some degree. And in fields, you've got this incorporation of a little bit of wind, more natural gas, and nuclear as we move forward in that scenario. And so what I'll share with you is that the next three charts, and then we'll conclude, the next three charts largely look similar in shape. So Pennsylvania global gross state product, employment, and population. They follow a similar trend amongst these three elements. So in highways, you can see that GSP and you'll see that employment and population are also slightly declining after a quick blip early on in the scenario. In homesteads, you see some modest growth amongst the three, And in fields, you see that there is slightly more growth amongst those. So here's employment. You see those lines look largely similar to what you saw on the previous page, and more similar still, this idea of population following the same trend. So I told you I wasn't going to belabor this too much, so we've come to the final Mentimeter piece. Appreciate everybody's engagement and attention so far. So one final set of questions. What surprises you about the data? Does anything feel inconsistent? Employment and gross state product decreases in highways. Lack of participatory process to inform data. So this was largely done through Penn State and our partners within the Energy Collaborative. The CapEx seems unusual. The increase driven by nuclear. So why would population go down in highways if the economy is growing? Fields require strong upfront investment in natural gas over potential generation for nuclear. CapEx is higher for highways than fields. Yep, largely driven by the back-end nuclear. State-driven transition is much more negative over time. Nuclear grows in all scenarios by a lot. Lack of energy growth in wind. Highways had the best decreases in emissions. Yep. Okay, which scenario creates the most potential risk for your business or industry? All right, so this is an interesting question. So if you keep that in mind, I encourage you all to consider what those implications are and what would need to be true for you to prevent highways from coming to fruition. What are the other organizations and individuals you need to collaborate with in order to make sure that this does not come to fruition? What do you need to do? Who do you need to talk to? Who do you need to be in conversation with? I think one of the biggest takeaways that we take from all of these stories is that none of this can happen in isolation. All right, final question here. Which scenario creates the most opportunity for your business? Fields and homesteads are neck and neck. Okay, Abby, I'll turn it over to you to conclude. Thank you so much for your engagement, everybody.
Okay, so a few things. One is that we are going to open it up to some questions, which we'd love to field. I will just note that it is very tempting to get caught up in the data of these totally hypothetical yet plausible realities. And I will say that, what we basically did is we took these stories and then we said, what happens to the numbers? Because that helps make it a little bit more real. And then we struggle and change it up every single time we present this of how much do you kind of integrate the story and the data and tell it together, because it does make it more real. But I encourage you to kind of read the stories, to just immerse yourself in it and actually see some of this. The other thing I consider you to do is is if you're really into this stuff and you want to work with other energy stakeholders, people who care about Pennsylvania's energy economy from across the state, you can participate by just, filling out a little form. So another QR code for you takes you to a different place, though, and you can sign up and participate. You can also do so just on our website, and we have it on some of the tables out here to get a little QR code. So you're welcome to. There's no kind of barrier to entry, and there are some folks in the room who participate, and it's a great group and a very special place. And we are able to talk about things from points of complete and utter disagreement, with the understanding that we all are actually going to be part of our energy future, all of our companies and our businesses and our organizations and us as individuals. And we're going to actually have completely differing perspectives on what we want to move toward and what we want to move away from. And that's what makes the work cool. We just think that the work's going to happen better if we're working together. And that's not a matter of how we seek consensus around this. But we think that a connected network just allows us to work better. And so that is kind of our perspective. And at the same time, we know that you probably have some questions for us. And so we are excited to field those questions. Danielle, I guess I'll turn it over to you to facilitate that process. So.
Yeah, well, first of all, please join me in giving Abby, Rachel, and Adam another round of applause for a great interactive session. So we have about 5-10 minutes for questions, and we would love to hear from you, your voices. We saw lots of cool words on the screen, but love to get into it.
So thank you for running through those. If I understood correctly, those were possibility scenarios. You were taking known unknowns and trying to figure out, hey, what scenarios, what situations this put us into. I'm curious if you all have done anything with unknown scenario planning, like we have no idea, like a lot of the stuff that I think you guys teed up on there, like aliens land or whatever else the black swan events are. They're like, and how do we figure out through those, or what's the future that we want to create? Just curious if we've done any work on that front.
Yeah, it's a good question for me. So, okay, so here's the thing. There is a really interesting balance of having things that are, having things that are like just provocative and challenging and interesting enough, and not having it be so wild that you all vote that it's completely implausible, right? And so I don't know that in previous iterations of this work that we could have easily said, you know what, pandemic, and that feels realistic, right? Global, massive shutdown of the world in ways that we have never seen before. So this is partly why you have kind of expert facilitation from the outside. I will say that if anything, certain moments felt the group was not challenging things enough. They were kind of like going with what they think will happen a little more often, and it required push from our facilitators to be like, no, wilder, bigger, more uncertain. This is too boring, and it's unlikely the next 25 years will be that boring. And so there was a lot of push and pull more in that direction than anything else. And this is partly because we didn't start with a group of random workshop participants. They're people who are already kind of, participating in our energy collaborative. So they have that orientation. And they went like really narrow and specific on like, in PJM, this is what we think. We were like, no, pull it back out. What happens to society? Like what happens in the world around you? What's happening in your community? So it's a little different than what you're asking, these kind of uncertainties. But at a certain point, you do have to kind of play around with something specific, right? And there are slightly more, interesting little components that are in the stories themselves. There's a constitutional convention in one of them. And so I can't remember which one. Is it? Yeah. Anyway, so there's some interesting little moments to that, but you really do have to strike a balance of what feels like it could be plausible even with these big situations coming to play. I think the other thing is that we spent a lot of time before we tried to game out these future possible realities by playing around with what the drivers could be and what the uncertainties could be. So while that sounds like we're kind of putting guardrails on the sandbox, it was really actually much more, once we kind of take these things in different directions, what are we really working with? What are we playing with? And so we did try to push the creative thinking in the room, but yeah, I would imagine you do this with a different group of folks, you get some, wildly different stuff. And Adam, I don't know if you want to.
Well, just as like one little tidbit here. Like we did this, as we alluded to, in I began in like 2017, even before I started with the Commonwealth. We concluded it by the end of 2018. If you go back and read that narrative, there is a black swan event that isn't called out specifically. Could be any number of things. You're supposed to use your imagination. And during the workshop period, we argued for half of a day over what that black swan event could be, right? To your point, like what are the unknown unknowns? And it could be a dramatic escalation in the opioid crisis that requires, major interventions. It could be a climate disaster. It could be, some sort of like, conflagration in another part of the world, violent conflict. Nobody suggested a pandemic. Nobody. Never came up. And so like it just kind of goes to show, I think, some of the challenges with that. It's a good point. It's really well taken. I think Abby explained it, but I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's good context.
No
for
one
that
said
question.
alien attack, actually.
No one said alien.
This time or last.
Hi, just for all of the scenarios, were there any specific industry sectors that you believed would have more growth in each one, or were they kept relatively constant between the three scenarios?
I wish Seth were here to answer this specifically, and also our friends at REMI modeled some of this stuff out, and they do have some industry-specific data. I will say that as we've presented this to different groups, we have, especially with fields, some very kind of extreme reactions of people being like, that is so bad, or that is so good. So, because it's kind of focused on just industry growth. And so I think that some of it does show up a little bit as you read the story, right? And that ultimately is what informed the data. So you start to see build out of certain kind of technologies, infrastructure, focus on certain sectors, that kind of thing. And so those themes that play out in the stories themselves also then play out in the data where you start to see kind of the industry implications. Rachel or Adam, I don't know if you want to add to that, but yeah.
No, I think the one thing that you can do is if you look at the data with the investments in the power sector, I mean, that's something that Penn State was able to model out. That's not an economy-wide assumption by any means. And I think the other thing that I would point out, if you do go back and take a couple of minutes to reflect on that, is that the percentages, the difference between percentages and raw numbers, right? So like you're looking at like, maybe in one, there's a large, I think it's highways has a really large, like through 2/3, 3/4 of new investments beginning tomorrow in the power sector are in nuclear, but the total investments I think are relatively small, right? So it's like, it's a really large percentage of a much smaller pie than in the Homesteads scenario, and so you can kind of piece some of that stuff together and think about how some of those investments would unfold. But I think to Abby's point, it was considerably more broad, right? Economic growth can take many different shapes and sizes. So it wasn't about saying like, oh, the steel industry, does this and another industry does that. It's just more about, thinking at a very macro level.
The data in the report goes a little bit more deep, and I will say that our friends who helped with the data crunching could have gone even more deep, and we had to just, find what the right intermediary, place was, but yeah.
Hello. I was shocked to see how much nuclear was on the screen. And so, in 30 years, we had 3 big events, and when they happen, you can't go back for decades. And now, even if it is nice and safe, we have Russia throwing a drone in one, they've got machinists on another, and Israel just did some code to Iran's to make theirs buck wild. So what do you guys think about nuclear?
Okay, I'm going to take part one of your question. No, what I'll say is I find that to be both not surprising at all, like when you actually read it, and yet somehow surprising that in every scenario you just have massive growth of nuclear and huge investments that come with that. We're talking about, really significant capex, and that data was crunched after the scenarios, right? So we play it out, and no matter what, that's how you get to meet power needs and emissions goals and things like that. So now, in terms of kind of what you're describing about the larger geopolitical context and how that goes forward, our scenarios don't contend with it. And so our specific kind of, disposition on those things, I mean, I hate to say it, is almost kind of neither here nor there. I think it's much more just then how individual organizations, governments, entities, kind of how all of you think about that. If we do have a future where in all of these different scenarios that we've painted, where they are different, some of them really emphasize regional stuff, some of them state top down, some of them have economic as the main drivers, et cetera. In all those scenarios, we're talking about a significant build out of nuclear. And so then it kind of forces all of us to say, all right, well, what now for our industry, for our organization, for our own kind of role that we play day to day? And so I think that's really more the question and less about, kind of where each of us are on this, because we're going to have to take that back to our own organization at Team PA and think about what does it look like to lean in to nuclear or to be proactive in terms of how we game this out over time. And I think we're all trying to figure that out. It's a large conversation topic, certainly news headlines like the Constellation restart of aspects of 3 Mile Island to bring additional capacity sparks all kind of conversations too. So we're starting to see little buds of that, but what does it look like to make the kind of investments that we saw across those 3 different scenarios, forces all of us to contend with that from the different seats that we all sit in. And I don't know if either of you want to. Thank you very much.
I think so too. The only thing I would add is just the consideration of baseload power in this broader conversation. The state of Pennsylvania is inherently blessed with great natural resources, and yet we still realize that that is not something that can persist forever. So we do need to start thinking in terms of what energy transition looks like and how we can get more of that baseload power. Nuclear seems to be one of these options, but we don't need to get hung up on that necessarily. Nuclear as well has a requirement for large upfront capital investment at this point, so it's something that we have to contend with. I would just continue with Abby's train of thought to say that, if this is something that is plausible and within the energy mix, what does that look like and what needs to be true in order to make sure that we've got the safety cultures and reliability required to make that come to life?
Rachel made me think of like one other tiny point, which is also that a lot of how Pennsylvania has dominated that nuclear supply chain and had all different kind of components has really shifted over time. And so if we want to continue to play a leadership role there, investing in everything from the training and safety and infrastructure that's required and be a key part of a nuclear supply chain, because even if you don't see that for Pennsylvania, presumably, other states, other countries are going to lean into nuclear as well. And so thinking about the role that Pennsylvania can play, that's part of it too. And what do we need to move towards away from, based on, honestly, decades of policy that have come before this point that have resulted in certain things. I could also imagine different kinds of nuclear coming online based on different scenarios. So for example, in Homesteads, wouldn't be surprised if what plays out is much more in terms of SMRs and microreactors, whereas we're talking potentially in, a scenario like Fields about real big investments in new nuclear in different kinds of ways, right? So I think that's the other way to think about it. I hope that kind of sort of answers at least parts of your question without me jumping into political quagmire. So.
All right.